the Kristallnacht of November the 10th, 1938, to the physical extermination decision on July the 31st, 1941. This was the logic of events, each of which evolved from the one before and led inevitably to its successors. The way of anti-Semitism led to Auschwitz. Hitler knew that for the success of his lying doctrines, he would have to use the age-old weapon of hate. He needed to place before the German people an object to which could be attributed everything loathsome and contemptible, an object worthy of abhorrence, which would be the absolute antithesis of the Aryan man, the Nazi, and whose existence and activities could be presented as the cause of all the failures and difficulties that Germany had encountered. The object was the Jew. Hitler had other hates. The Marxists and Communists were regular targets for his virulent attacks. But there was this difference. The latter could redeem themselves in his eyes by turning their backs on their former faith and by finding their way into the bosom of National Socialism. The Jew, however, was the eternal scapegoat. He had no way out. He was in no position to escape the storm of hatred. Anyone who reads the speeches, writings, and reported conversations of Hitler is shocked at his ignorance, at his ability to describe fantasies as if they really existed, and above all, at his power to persuade others of the truth of the most enormous lies. Otto Strasser, one of his supporters who became his opponent, this Otto Strasser wrote of him: I have been asked many times what is the secret of Hitler's extraordinary power as speaker. I can only attribute it to his uncanny intuitions, which infallibly diagnoses the ills from which his audience is suffering. If he tries to bolster up his argument with theories or quotations from books he has only imperfectly understood, he scarcely rises above a very poor mediocrity. But let him throw away his crutches and step out boldly, speaking as the Spirit moves him, and he is promptly transformed into one of the greatest speakers of the century. Adolf Hitler enters a hall, he snuffs the air, for a minute he gropes, feels his way, senses the atmosphere. Suddenly he bursts forth. His words go like an arrow to the target. He touches each private wound on the raw, liberating the mass unconscious, expressing its innermost aspirations, telling it what it most wants to hear.
And Hitler did, in fact, liberate the hatred of the Jew, which was latent in the hearts of large sections of the German people, intensify it and stimulate it into greater activity. The germ of anti-Semitism was already there. He fed it with appropriate conditions and transformed it into the source of an epidemic. For the purposes of Nazi Germany's internal policy, the Jew was a convenient object of hatred. He was weak and defenseless. The world outside remained silent when he was persecuted and contented itself with verbal reactions that did little harm. The Jew was pilloried as a supporter of communism and therefore an enemy of the German people. In the same breath, He was accused of being a capitalist and therefore an enemy of the workers. National Socialism had found an object of hostility appropriate to both halves of its name, and it set him up as a target for both national enmity and class hatred. The Jew was also a ready target through which the attention of the public could be diverted from other problems. This too was an age-old weapon which had been used by many anti-Semites down the ages. On this point we shall find the accused saying, and I quote, "The Jewish question was a welcome tactic to divert attention from other reverses." Whenever any difficulties of another sort arose, they took flight, at least at this time, to the Jewish question, and immediately the diversion was created. This was done not only by Hitler himself, not only by the Gauleiter, this was the practice of everyone among the so-called high leadership. This is Adolf Eichmann's words. A confused and blinded world was not alarmed by this campaign of hatred and the denial of human rights. It did not understand that the persecution of the Jews was only the beginning of an onslaught on the entire world. The man whose henchmen hurled the infamous words, "When Jewish blood spurts from the knife, then all goes doubly well. Wenn Judenblut von Messer spritzt, dann geht's nochmal so gut." The same man would soon, by a natural development, and led by the same master feeling of hate, proclaim that all the cities of England would be subjected to the same fate as bombed Coventry. In order to complete the picture, we should point out that there were in Germany tens of thousands of scientists and ecclesiastics, statesmen and authors and ordinary people who dared to help the Jews, to raise their heads in opposition to the iniquitous regime, and even to rebel against it. And among these were men whose names were famous in German science and culture. Thousands of opponents of the bloody regime were imprisoned and were later destined to suffer greatly in concentration camps before the Nazi monster was beheaded. Thousands of these died without seeing the day of victory. Hundreds of ecclesiastics were arrested and imprisoned. There were also examples of personal bravery, like that of the priest who was sent by Eichmann to a concentration camp for intervening openly on behalf of the Jews. There were Germans who concealed Jews and shared their rations with them, and who at the risk of their lives helped them to hide or obtain Aryan papers. And there were others who maintained an anti-Hitler underground. During the war, there were Germans who protested to Hitler at the disgrace the Gestapo was bringing on the German people by acting like beasts of prey, as they described the extermination of the Jews. There were also soldiers who tried to frustrate the killings by direct intervention. But after all is said and done, these were a small minority. The decisive majority of the German people made peace with the new regime and were phlegmatic witnesses of the most terrible crime ever perpetrated in human history. And when Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, made a public bonfire of the creations of men of the spirit, Jewish and non-Jewish. The works of such men as Thomas Mann, Wassermann, Einstein, Freud, Upton Sinclair, H.G. Wells, Solar, Havelock Ellis, and scores of others, because they were in opposition to the German spirit, he proclaimed. The soul of the German people can again express itself. These flames not only illuminate the final end of an old era, they also light up the new. These are Goebbels' words. The majority of German intellectuals were ready to warm themselves at those bonfires and to accept that as their spiritual guide the false glitter of their flames. Nazi Germany became the scene of an anti-Jewish campaign directed and spurred on by brutish passions of hate. The slogan, Germany awaken, Jewry die, Deutschland erwache, Juda verrecke, appeared on the walls. The Jews were accused of every fault and defect in existence. Communists, whom Hitler hated, were Jews, and Der Stürmer, that odious newspaper edited by Julius Streicher, who was eventually executed by sentence of the International Military Tribunal. In order to denigrate the Jew, all his works had to be denounced. For this purpose, the Nazis defied the greatest Jewish creation of all the ages, the Bible. Alfred Rosenberg, one of the thinkers of the movement, demanded that the Holy Scriptures be removed from any sphere where they could be a spiritual influence or source of religious faith. He considered it a prime defect of the Protestant faith that it sanctifies the Old Testament. There was talk of the redemption of Jesus from his connections with Judaism, in order to make it possible to degrade the people who gave him to the world. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that forgery which describes the Jewish conspiracy to rule the world, and which had long been exposed as a base fabrication, was revived as a valuable means of propaganda and was widely distributed and taught. Even the loathsome blood libel, long banned by popes and kings, was revived. It was later to appear in a new and unprecedentedly cynical guise on May the 19th, 1943, at the height of the war. The chief of the SS, Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, sent to Eichmann's superior officer Kaltenbrunner, chief of the security forces of the Reich, hundreds of copies of the book Jewish Ritual Murder, and asked him to distribute it among those dealing with Jewish affairs. He ordered that steps be taken to spread the blood libel in Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, in order to persuade hesitating governments to expel the Jews. Himmler proposed to Kaltenbrunner the setting up of a special radio station for the spread of anti-Semitism, beamed towards England and the United States, over which material from the Stürmer would be broadcast. In addition, he wrote, personnel should immediately be allocated to follow up notices published by the police and courts in England, so that we may be able, through our transmitter, to broadcast notices to the effect that in such and such a place a child is missing who was murdered, of course, by the Jews for ritual purposes. In my opinion, he added, we can, in general, make immeasurable progress in setting in motion powerful anti-Semitic propaganda in the English language, and perhaps also in Russian, by using the accusation of ritual murder. But let us not anticipate events. On January the 30th, 1933, Hindenburg gave the rule of Germany over into Hitler's hands. Did the old man know what he was doing to his people and the world? After swearing in the members of the new government, he said to them, "And now, gentlemen, forward with the help of God." Germany did indeed stride forward towards war, horror, and shame.
Even before the power was firmly in their hands, the Nazis initiated official measures of persecution against the Jews. On April 1st, 1933, only 2 months after the inception of their rule, they organized the Day of Boycott to give symbolic form to the goal of uprooting the Jews and driving them out of the German Reich. Jews were beaten and imprisoned in concentration camps. Aryan customers were forbidden to enter Jewish places of business. It was then that Robert Welch wrote his unforgettable article in the Jüdische Rundschau, the organ of German Jewry. Wear with pride the yellow badge. But even Welch could not foresee that the yellow badge would become the distinctive sign which a few years later would be forced upon all the Jews in countries ruled by the Nazis, so that they might be more easily identified for the purpose of the bloodbath. The economic boycott of the Jews was kept up until their final extermination. At a later stage it was enforced by means of legislation. Thus a series of laws excluded Jews from a number of professions. Law, medicine, and teaching were closed to them. They were dismissed from the army. In 1935 the Nuremberg laws were enacted, which forbade Jews to intermarry with Gentiles and deprived them of German citizenship. Later they were driven out of industry and expelled from the entire German economy. After the Nazis had succeeded in using anti-Semitism as an important instrument for securing their power in Germany itself, they planned to use the same poison of hate in order to unite the enemies of the Jews throughout the world and to undermine by this means the opposition to the hegemony of Nazi Germany. And while German military might cast its shadow of terror on peoples and lands, silencing the voice of reason, anti-Semitism was exploited as a deliberate expedient to undermine the conscience of the nations, to excite the basest of passions, and to encourage Quisling and other collaborators. The Jew was described in the official publications of the party in the German Reich as an enemy to the peace of the world. And there was a proposal for an alliance between the peoples against Judaism, ein Völkerbund gegen Juda. Wherever the Nazi conqueror set foot, there awaited him a prepared group of adventurers, traitors to their country, underworld characters, sometimes plain assassins, who cast lustful eyes on Jewish property and lent their unclean hands to the destructive work. Wherever the German legions trod, they introduced the suppression of human freedom and the whipping up of Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism became an excellent article of export, to be sown everywhere and cultivated by German ambassadors and representatives abroad. We shall see during this trial how the Nazis used the deliberate fanning of anti-Jewish hostility and agitation in order to form fascist parties in various countries, to facilitate their work of undermining the independence of peoples and states, and to prepare the fifth column, which was at their disposal in all the countries they conquered. This fifth column was always anti-Semitic, and it was organized and developed by exploiting hatred of the Jew. Acceptance of Nazi doctrine and a deliberate, carefully fostered anti-Semitism came to be one and the same thing throughout the entire range of movements developed by the Reich. The National Sammlung Quislingsparty in Norway, Mussert's NSB in Holland, the Croix de Feu in France, the De Grelle movement in Belgium, Hlinka's party in Slovakia, the Austershis of Pavelic in Croatia, the Iron Guard in Romania, Salasi's Arrow Cross in Hungary, the Ukrainska Povstanskaya Armia in the Ukraine, the Perkomkrust in Latvia, the DNAS in Byelorussia, and others. All were fascist, all totalitarian, all anti-Semitic. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, labored to set up an anti-Semitic international as a vanguard of corruption among all the nations, to pave the way for the armies of conquest. Anti-Semitism in the hands of the Nazis was a weapon no less efficient and deadly than their cannon, bombers, submarines, and the rest of the death-dealing weapons which they brought into operation against peoples and lands. In the end, the military pride of Germany was defeated. The voice of the cannon silenced, the bombers shot down, and the submarines sunk. But the poisonous seed of anti-Semitism spread, still lives, and its sprouts continue to grow. At times it even lifts again its monstrous head when its followers go out at night to scroll their swastikas on the walls. Even on the verge of defeat in World War II, when the balance of the scales was moving toward the side of the Allies, when the Red Army had forced the retreat of the Germans from most of their conquests in the East, when the forces of the West had brought about the surrender of Italy, when the greatest expeditionary force in history was preparing in the British Isles for a mighty invasion in the fateful summer of 1944, when the cities of Germany itself had been in part reduced to ruins. In April of that same year, the German Foreign Ministry convened a meeting of diplomats in the European capitals for a consultation on ways and means of strengthening Jew hatred in the world. At this meeting, Ambassador Schleyer gave an account of the progress of anti-Semitism in England and the United States, suggested lines of action for the future, emphasized that the spread of anti-Semitism was one of Nazi Germany's military aims, and declared that the extermination of the Jews in the East had already deprived Jewry of her biological reserves, though Judaism still existed in the Soviet Union, England, and the United States. In his conclusion, he said, "Not only in Germany, but also throughout the world, the problem of the Jews must find its solution." The assembled diplomats then went on to a detailed discussion of the next steps to be taken to disseminate Jew hatred by means of literature, caricatures, films, and the press. The activities for each country were planned in accordance with its special circumstances. The Slovakians must be told that the Jews were identical with Bolshevik Russia, and they should be offered in place of the pan-Slavic idea, the ideal of pan-anti-Semitism. In Turkey, the protocols of the Elders of Zion would be distributed. As for England and the United States, the ether waves should be flooded with improved radio propaganda. In France, the activities of the Anti-Jewish Institute and its exhibitions should be expanded. Propaganda pamphlets should be sent to Switzerland. The Italians told the Jews deal on the black market, and the Swedes sent postcards with anti-Jewish jokes. Thus the Nazis tried to accomplish through anti-Semitism what they could not achieve by force of arms. The wicked, even at the gate of hell, do not repent, says a Hebrew proverb. In April 1945, at the moment of his death agonies, when the Soviet cannon were thundering in the streets of Berlin, when Hitler sat imprisoned in the cellar of the Reichskanzlei, his entire world in ruins and his country stricken, over the corpses of 6 million Jews. At that moment the Führer wrote his political last will and testament. He bequeathed to his people the injunction of eternal hatred for the Jews, and he concluded, "And above all, I herewith order the leaders of the people and their subordinates to maintain scrupulously the racial laws and to struggle without mercy against international Judaism, the poisoner of all the world's peoples." Even from beyond the grave, Hitler was still trying to sow the seeds of hatred and destruction for the Jewish people.
The persecution of the Jews in Germany, the occupied countries, and the satellites was part of the official policy of the Nazi state and party. And the official institutions of the Reich, including the Foreign Office, the Propaganda Ministry, and even the army, were utilized for the purpose. But the chief tools created by the Nazi party to dominate Germany and impose a reign of terror on the occupied territories were 3 criminal organizations: the SS, the SD, and the Gestapo, to all 3 of which Eichmann belonged. At its inception in 1921, the National Socialist Party set up the stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, which was the executive arm of the propaganda machine. It was these who spread the idea of Lebensraum, and they supplied the ruffians who instigated street brawls and quarrels in saloons. When the Nazis took over the government, they were also used to suppress opponents and imprison them in concentration camps. In 1925, the SS Schutzstaffel was set up as the elite of the SA. Its initial aim, at least formally, was to serve as a personal guard for Hitler and other leaders. But very quickly the SS was transformed into an instrument for the complete domination over the party, later over the Reich, and finally over the whole of conquered Europe. The SS was an order set up for a special purpose. Its chief, Heinrich Himmler, organized it with deliberate care so that it might be a powerful fist to strike and subjugate every opponent or rebel. Hence, only picked men were accepted for service in the organization. They were the choicest elite. When Himmler was appointed Reichsführer SS, that is the director of the organization, it had only 280 members. At the outbreak of war, it numbered about 250,000 who received military training and were organized in quasi-military units. Later, Himmler set up the armed SS, Waffen-SS, which were select military units to serve as a counterweight against the ordinary German army in case the latter ever showed us signs of faltering in its loyalty to the Führer. Thus, Himmler created a powerful organization having its own army, with its own stores of weapons and ammunition, an independent economy, and even separate laws and its own judicial processes. These were the most faithful of the faithful, whose duty it was to fortify the rule of the idol Hitler and of Himmler, his high priest. That satanic force which was Nazism constructed its own instruments of rule with great thoroughness and fiendish cunning. It also set up an internal party organization, Sicherheitsdienst des Reichsführers SS, known as the SD. For external consumption, it was described as the brain of the party of the state. But very soon it became an internal espionage and detective organization which did not balk at any means for achieving its purposes. Heydrich, who organized and commanded the service, always contended, one must know as much as possible about people. For that purpose, a party intelligence network was set up which included confidential agents, V-Leute, ordinary agents, A-Leute, informers, Z-Leute, casual employees, H-Leute, and doubtful informants, U-Leute. They were happy to receive any information whatsoever about economic development, social life, politics, and especially about the private lives of party members. Heydrich wanted to know every possible detail about the members of the party and their opponents. Everything relating to their character and weaknesses, their hobbies and habits, and things relating to their character, scandals in which they have been involved, their personal desires and love life, the places they frequented, expenditures and income of industrial firms, the movements of bank deposits. In brief, every item that might possibly be exploited in one way or another against a man or an institution, especially if it might be used as a threat for purposes of blackmail. All this was patiently and thoroughly recorded in an enormous personal filing system that used about 100,000 regularly employed agents, detectives, and informers. Nothing in the most intimate lives of all the leaders of the Reich and afterwards of the leaders and administrators of the whole of Europe escaped the vigilance of the SD. Clearly, such an instrument soon became a weapon of great strength. When the Nazis came to power, a clash between the SS and the SA
was inevitable. Once Hitler had proclaimed that the two pillars of his regime were the state and the party, it was clear that only one of the two party organs could be the central core of the party pillar. Himmler had no difficulty in defeating the SA, and the notorious 1934 purge took place, in which its leaders were assassinated. Himmler's mastery over the party was now absolute. But in order to consolidate the regime, there was a need not only for sources of information, but also for means of implementation. From 1936 on, Himmler became the supreme chief of all branches of the German police, political and criminal. He set up a network of SS chiefs and superior police officers who operated as his representatives under the command of Heydrich, who was also the chief of the security police and the Gestapo. After the outbreak of World War II, Himmler divided the SS into a dozen head offices. One of these was the RSHA, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Security Main Office, which thereafter was in charge of the police forces. Its central function was the suppression of all opposition, and its chief was Heydrich. Amt Department 4 was the Gestapo, headed by Miller. Within this was 4B4, the Jewish section, headed by Adolf Eichmann. At the disposal of Himmler, as has been said, were also actual military forces, including the Death's Head units, Totenkopfverbände, which carried out the deeds of horror in the concentration camps. The SS Verfügungstruppen, the bone breakers of the opponents of the regime, and various police units. Thus the SS expanded and developed into a distinct and independent body which dominated the entire nervous system of Germany. It was actually a state within the state, with a central and decisive function. All Himmler's opponents in the struggle for power and influence in the Reich were doomed to failure. Hitler always supported his faithful Heinrich. Only occasionally did it seem that Himmler himself was careful not to encroach upon the army proper, and had to compromise and make concessions to marshals and generals of the OKW, the High Command of the Armed Forces, many of whom despised him and even refused to allow him the rank of general. Yet even this latter goal was achieved in 1944, when he was appointed Supreme Commander of the Reserves, Ersatzherr. The International Military Tribunal, whose decision in this matter is binding upon us according to our laws, wrote the following in its proceedings, Nuremberg, 1948. Volume 22. The creation of the RSHA represented the formalization at the top level of the relationship under which the SD served as the intelligence agency for the security police. A similar coordination existed in the local offices. Within Germany and the areas that were incorporated in the Reich for the purpose of civil administration, the local offices of the Gestapo, criminal police, and SD were formally separate. They were subject to coordination by inspectors of the security police and SD on the staffs of the local higher SS and police leaders, however, and one of the principal functions of the local SD units was to serve as the intelligence agency for the local Gestapo units. In the occupied territories, the formal relationship between local units of the Gestapo, criminal police, and SD was slightly closer. They were organized into local units of the security police and SD, and were under the control of both the RSHA and of the higher SS and police leader, who was appointed by Himmler to serve on the staff of the occupying authority. Originally, one of the primary functions of the Gestapo was the prevention of any political opposition to the Nazi regime, a function which it performed with the assistance of the SD. The Gestapo and the SD also dealt with charges of treason and with questions relating to the press, the churches, and the Jews. As the Nazi program of anti-Semitic persecution increased in intensity, the role played by these groups became increasingly important. The Gestapo and SD were used for purposes which were criminal under the Charter, involving the persecution and extermination of the Jews, brutalities and killings in concentration camps, excesses in the administration of occupied territories, the administration of the slave labor program, and the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war. In dealing with the Gestapo, the tribunal includes all executive and administrative officials of Amt 4 of the RSHA. The tribunal declares to be criminal within the meaning of the Charter the group composed of those members of the Gestapo and SD holding the positions enumerated in the preceding paragraph, who became or remained members of the organization with knowledge that it was being used for the commission of acts declared criminal by Article 6 of the Charter, or who were personally implicated as members of the organization in the commission of such crimes. And this is what the International Military Tribunal said about the SS. The SS was even a more general participant in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The SS played a particularly significant role in the persecution of the Jews. It is impossible to single out any one portion of the SS which was not involved in these criminal activities. The Allgemeine SS was an active participant in the persecution of the Jews and was used as a source of concentration camp guards. Units of the Waffen-SS were directly involved in the killing of prisoners of war and the atrocities in occupied countries. It supplied personnel for the Einsatzgruppen and had command over the concentration camp guards after its absorption of the Totenkopf SS, which originally controlled the system. Various SS police units were also widely used in the atrocities in occupied countries and the extermination of the Jews there. The SS Central Organization supervised the activities of these various formations and was responsible for such special projects as the human experiments and final solution of the Jewish question.
In dealing with the SS, the tribunal included all persons who had been officially accepted as members of the SS, including the members of Allgemeine SS, members of the Waffen-SS, members of the SS Doppelverbände, and the members of any of the different police forces who were members of the SS. The tribunal declares to be criminal within the meaning of the Charter the group composed of those persons who had been officially accepted as members of the SS, as enumerated in the preceding paragraph, who became or remained members of the organization with knowledge that it was being used for the commission of acts declared criminal by Article 6 of the Charter, or who were personally implicated as members of the organization in the commission of such crimes, unquote. The SS set up all the concentration camps, work camps, and extermination centers. This organization, which was branded at the Nuremberg trials, was in fact an enormous conspiracy for the execution of crimes and horrors without precedent. In all the countries under German occupation, Himmler's special representatives were at work, whether as high officers of the SS and police, or direct representatives of the Reich Security Head Office. Direct representatives. In theory, These were subordinate to the regular civilian regime, but in practice they acted on their own initiative and were only subordinated to the occupation authorities as a matter of form. This fact was a natural result of the very nature of any totalitarian regime, which always gives great power to the police and especially to the secret police, and also of the military situation in the occupied countries, where the regime used these forces to suppress all opposition and to strengthen the institutions of police rule. The Reich Security Main Office, through the police officers, was thus in control of all the occupied areas. After the outbreak of the war with the Soviet Union, the SS was given additional and special powers. On July the 17th, 1941, Hitler ordered that security measures in all the occupation zones in the East be executed by the Reichsführer SS, who would be entitled to issue orders to all other authorities. We shall see later how Himmler used his enormous powers. In Jewish matters, Adolf Eichmann was the executive arm of the SS and of its cherished offspring, the RSHA. A directive issued by Rosenberg, Commissar for the Eastern Occupation Zones, was later found. It read, I quote, "In the light of a certain incident, I hereby forbid all civilian authorities in the Eastern Zone to take any active part in executions of any kind. The carrying out of executions, especially in connection with the extermination of the Jews, is the function of the security police and of the SD." Unquote. The first and principal means of repression used by the SS was the concentration camps, in which were developed and perfected systems of terror and employing all the resources available to modern technology of the century. The Nazi, that romantic mystic, the family man, who on the surface seemed to be a loving husband to his wife and a merciful father to his children, the lover of nature and of living things, was revealed in the concentration camps as a monster of insane brutality, who did not hesitate to trample on human beings without blinking an eyelash as if they were insects. One of the shocking chapters in the history of Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, is the part where he describes his own tranquil family life at home, the education he gave his sons, his affectionate regard for his wife. All this going on just on the other side of the high-tension barbed wire fence of the terrible extermination camp, in which each and every day between 5,000 and 10,000 people were being put to death. The mere imprisonment of a man without a trial in which he can try to prove his innocence and without any indication of when he may be released, that is terrible enough. But if we add to this a regime of humiliation, forced labor, beatings, whippings, torture and hangings, we may understand the terrible repressive power exercised by the Nazi concentration camp. The Gestapo had learned well how to exploit all the human frailties of their victims. They knew that starvation and torture can break even strong men, that by means of brutality and humiliation it is possible to efface the divine image leaving a man insensitive, inert, an obedient robot who will do as he is told, even when he is ordered to dig his own grave. The Aryan opponent of the regime could repent and accept the yoke of National Socialism. He could hope to be set free, to be allowed to live, to regain his position in society. And many did so, overwhelmed by the hypnotic force of Hitler and his ever-growing power, for success has its own power of persuasion. Only the Jew had no road to deliverance, for every measure carefully taken to bring down his opposition and bring him to a point where he no longer believed in his very right to exist. On him too the hypnotic supremacy of the victorious master race had its effect. In addition, every means of humiliation was deliberately employed to destroy his faith in himself. When a man is whipped across the face and he cannot react, when he is deprived of food until he writhes with the pangs of hunger, when men and women, boys and girls are given orders to perform their executory functions in full sight of one another like beasts, when women are made to run naked before the gods, when morning and night executions by shooting and hanging prove that the lives of Jews are absolutely worthless, when killing and butchery take place before your eyes for no reason at all, out of mere caprice or for sport, when a score of times per day you are shown that you are abandoned and defenseless, and that your very life depends on the mood and whim of any of the SS men that day, under such circumstances, it was not difficult to create a condition in which most of these unfortunates, oppressed and downtrodden, were stripped of all faith and feeling, bereft for the most part of any desire to go on living, their supreme desire a speedy and painless death.
The prisoner in the concentration camp was finally brought almost to the point where he could hardly distinguish any longer between good and evil. He was reduced to a beast-like state, almost entirely lacking in such human feelings as sympathy, grief, or capacity to respond to misfortune. During his labors in a slave camp, while working in the concentration camp's sewing shop, on a pile of plundered clothing he had been ordered to clean and repair, a prisoner might come across the clothes of his dead wife or children. He would be shocked for a moment, but he would quickly quench the glow in his eyes and carry on. He would not shout, not go mad, not raise his fist against those who had enslaved him, but would go on with his work, patching the bullet holes and removing the yellow batches of shame, so that the clothing might be used after repair by the murderers themselves. The men of the Gestapo knew a great deal about the conquered peoples and tried to fan the flames of hatred for the Jew wherever they went. But they also understood very well where and in what circles their work would reap its best reward. The incitement to anti-Jewish pogroms was carried out generally in the occupied zones of Eastern Europe and the Baltic countries, where they could rely on the crude anti-Semitism that prevailed in various circles, to give them a scientific basis and official support for acts of murder and pillage. Here the hardened hooligans could rest assured that the authorities were on their side. We shall submit to the court the reports of the Einsatzgruppen, special mission groups, which tell of their success in inciting some of the local population to pogroms, but add that since the riots had not yet liquidated the Jews, it would be necessary to go over to methods of direct extermination. The Gestapo also knew that the will to survive is a primal instinct, and they pressed it too into their service. Having broken the spirits of all their victims, they would select a few for special duties, or grant them what seemed like authority. The overall extermination program was kept secret. As a result, it was possible to suggest to a number of individuals privately, whether expressly or by hints, that they would suffer no harm if they obeyed orders or acted as informers, that if they did what they were told, they might save their lives and those of their families. In general, the method of using the victim's own people against him was generally accepted. We shall submit to you Gestapo orders to the effect that the execution of hangings in concentration camps should be entrusted to other prisoners of the same nationality as those to be hanged, and that the executioners should be given 3 cigarettes as wages. The Nazis knew how to exploit for their purposes every human weakness and biological need. They even had brothels opened inside the concentration camps, to which those who kept in line were to be offered admittance. They were skilled in lies and falsehoods. They knew how to use every expedient to deceive their victims. After every manhunt in which thousands and tens of thousands of Jews were sent to their deaths, and others would manage to escape or hide, a rumor would be deliberately spread by the Nazis that this was the last operation of the kind, that those still surviving would no longer be touched, that there would be no more transports. And many individuals of the type that would cling to any hope, those who could not or would not believe that the fate of all the Jews had indeed been sealed, or who were exhausted with hunger, misery, and suffering, would venture out of their hiding places or return from the forests, only to be captured by their persecutors in a new manhunt. The tiger played with his victims at his own sweet will. We shall find Jews among those carrying out Nazi orders, in the Jewish police in the ghettos, and in the councils of elders. Even at the door of the gas chambers, there were Jews whose task was to calm the victims and persuade them that they were merely going to the showers. This was one of the most satanic aspects of the entire program: to deaden men's senses, to deprive them of all emotional and intellectual vigor, to leave no more than a terrified and lifeless Robert, so that it was possible to use the prisoners in the camps themselves as part of the murder machine against their own people. And the Gestapo could reduce to a minimum the number of their own men in the camps. Of course, at the end, even these robots did not escape the cruel fate of their people and were put to death with their brethren. It is extraordinary that even in the midst of this inferno, there were many Jews who succeeded in preserving the divine image and were not broken. There were also others. In this trial, we shall not deal with the Jews who carried out orders, either the capos or the members of the councils of elders. This is not the trial of the victims, but the trial of the destroyer. Nor shall we enter into the problem of the course a Jewish leader or public worker should have followed within the jaws of the tiger. Whether it should have been the way of Edelstein, who tried to organize the Theresienstadt ghetto, or the methods of Kastner, who tried to negotiate and found a tiny avenue of escape for a few people, or the course adopted by Chernyakov, who poisoned himself when he saw the Nazis were demanding that he give them, the Jews of Warsaw, to be sent to their death. This controversy has no place in the present trial. I do not think that today we can establish a book of rules for the proper behavior of a victim in his relations with the beast of prey, that we can say how this or that leader in Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, or Vienna should have behaved, whether he should have tried to save what he could, or to incite a rebellion, or to cling to every store of hope for deliverance, even when those hopes had no foundation. We are all, of course, proud of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, of the various examples of resistance and rebellion, of the partisans and fighters who struck out at the evil regime. In any case, this trial is not the tribunal at which this problem can be clarified, and we shall leave it to the historian of the Holocaust. In this trial, we are judging Adolf Eichmann. Is this a suitable point to adjourn for a while, Mr. Hausner? We shall adjourn for 20 minutes.
Very good point. This is what I told you. I told you that they're not going.